Okay, so in this video, I want to talk about Thomas Jefferson, race, and slavery. These are big subjects, and I'm going to have to hit the highlights, I think, if I want to make this a manageable video. But I hope it'll be a useful video, a timely video, particularly in light of current conversations about things like Mount Rushmore and various statues and whom we honor and whom we don't honor, renaming schools and buildings, and just the general state of our culture right now, given all of the various manifestations of wokeness that have infected that culture. I wanted to say something about it because I hope at least I have something useful to say. Before I get into all of that, let me just say, for people who don't know, I am in fact a college professor. I do have a PhD in history. I have taught primarily early American history courses: colonial America, American Revolution, early Republic, antebellum, Civil War, etc., etc. I have taught standalone courses on people like Thomas Jefferson, and in fact Jefferson himself. I've published a book on Jefferson and his friend James Madison, a number of articles as well. So Jefferson is very much in my academic wheelhouse. But more than that, he's someone whose legacy I think Americans discard or even diminish at their peril. And so I want to talk a little bit about this specific issue of Jefferson and race and slavery, because that, as far as I can tell, that's really the only area, or those are the only two areas in which Jefferson comes in for a fair amount of modern criticism. And so I want to put that criticism into some sort of context. And for folks who might be wondering, what gives with the Jefferson Memorial? Why have we put people like Jefferson on our currency? Why do we name our schools and our streets and everything else after people who were racists and slaveholders? Let me see if I can walk us through who I think Jefferson really was, and what his legacy on those major issues ought to be. Okay, so Jefferson on race and slavery. Let's first, and again, I'm going to have to do this. I'm going to have to do kind of the Cliff's Notes version, but I think that'll be good enough for the audience for which this is intended, which is to say the educated, intelligent viewership that I know tends to gravitate toward these sorts of conversations. Jefferson on race and slavery. Let's start with race. Okay, race. Was Jefferson a racist? Well, yeah, he was. He was a racist in the same way that his contemporaries, whether they were educated or not, were racists, were also racists. George Washington was a racist. In the next century, Abraham Lincoln was a racist. We have had a number of racists who have occupied high positions in our government. Woodrow Wilson was a racist. Franklin Roosevelt was an absolutely devout anti-Semite. There's no question about that. So depending on when you lived, there's a pretty good chance that the person whose ideas and life you're investigating is going to be a racist. I think that's true up until probably the latter fourth or maybe third of the 20th century. Okay? And the reason for that is that everyone simply believed in race. Okay? They thought race was an actual concept. They thought that the color of your skin actually dictated your qualities and your capabilities, and therefore your behavior. They saw that there were, even though they didn't know to think of them in this way, but they saw that there were genetic markers, right? I mean, children looked like their parents, sometimes had similar qualities, and so if it works for parents, they look the same way as their parents, and the behavioral traits are similar. Why not the same for races? And Jefferson comes in, and by the way, this is something that ought to distinguish us from them. It's so strange to me when people nowadays look back at those who lived 200 years ago and wonder, well, why didn't they think and behave the way we do? I mean, if you're asking that question, why don't people who lived centuries ago think and behave the way we do? Then, I mean, I hate to be harsh, but you probably should ask for a refund on your education. Okay? They didn't think and behave the way we do in all cases. In some ways they did, because human nature is constant. But this is one of those areas where you look back and you say, yeah, they actually did believe in race. And whether it was prejudice or custom or the kinds of sort of pseudo-scientific conclusions that I just ran through, that it was widespread. It was universal. You couldn't go anywhere on the face of the earth where there had been contact between people who looked different, people who had different skin tones. You couldn't go anywhere and not find a racism of some sort. Okay? So the decline in racism is a phenomenon of really just the last 40 or 50 years. And it's come about in large part because we know better, because we have access to biological science that tells us that race is in fact a garbage concept. It's constructed socially. It has absolutely no biological meaning. The amount of melanin that you have in your skin does not dictate anything about the way you think or the way you act. It doesn't dictate anything about your personal qualities. We know this. They didn't know it. Okay, so they believed in race, and in some ways, that makes our racial obsession all the more damning. I think future generations will look back on this moment in time and wonder how so many people could have been deluded into believing that something like race exists, into believing that something like white privilege or white fragility, believing that those things exist. Those are racist concepts. They assign particular qualities to groups of people based exclusively on their skin color. And they are made universals and absolutes by the people who advance those crazy theories. They are fundamentally racist theories. We know better. Okay? We should be beyond that. Okay? But they didn't know better. So Jefferson comes in particularly for criticism on this issue, because in the only book that he ever wrote, it was really just a collection of answers to questions that had been posed by a European naturalist. Jefferson wrote a book called Notes on the State of Virginia. It was published in the mid-1780s. And in that book, he ranged across a variety of topics, and one of which that came up, and came up several times, in fact, was slavery. And Jefferson was adamant about the fact that the existence of slavery in Virginia undermined the confidence of native Virginians, native white Virginians, in the doctrine of natural rights and natural liberty. Jefferson asked in that, but how can a people's liberties be secured when their belief in the fundamental equality of human beings is undermined day after day after day by the existence of slavery amongst them? And so Jefferson made a very powerful appeal for emancipation, but he also went into an extensive discussion of the differences between whites and blacks as he observed them. And reading those descriptions today is a bit jarring, I think, to the modern mind. And Jefferson reached some tentative conclusions about what he called the inferiority of the black race. He said they were equal in this way, equal in that way, but in the faculties of mind, they probably were inferior. And that, I think, justifiably has earned a fair amount of scrutiny. Now, it hasn't earned the kind of scrutiny that allows us to say, well, he doesn't think the way we do, or he didn't write the way we do, therefore we must condemn him and forget about everything else he ever wrote, because that's pathologically absurd. But we do have to wrestle with that. How was it that the person who wrote All Men Are Created Equal could then speculate on things like the inferiority of blacks in the only book he ever wrote? And by the way, people have been ranting about white supremacy. Jefferson was not a white supremacist. There were no white supremacists among the founding generation, among the Pantheon-level founders. Sure, there were white supremacists who lived in those days, but not the ones we've etched into marble and granite. Okay? Jefferson insisted that the American Indian was the equal of the whites, and he even in 1803 wrote it in a letter to a man named Benjamin Hawkins. He wrote that his great hope was that whites and Indians, that our settlements eventually would merge, we would meet together, and that we would intermix and become one people, and that we would then move westward together. Jefferson had a great deal of faith in the capability of the American Indian. He had not observed the American Negro, as he and people in his time would have referred to the slaves. He had not seen them in any condition but slavery. And so based on that observation and a few other deductions of questionable nature, he advanced the possibility, the possible conclusion that blacks were not equal to whites. However, I say this is jarring, and it is jarring. This doesn't sound like the sort of person we might want to put into granite or marble. But when you think about it this way, okay, first think about what Jefferson is actually saying and how it would have been received in his day. Jefferson was saying blacks might be inferior to whites. Well, is that really the sort of thing that you have to put into a book in 1784? Okay. How many people believed that? Well, lots of people believed that. Okay? Most people believed that. Okay? Most people believed in the doctrine of natural rights, natural liberties, but they also were racists. They also believed that their race was superior, hence the enslavement of Africans. Okay? So the simple fact that he wrote it in a book and knew that this is not going to be terribly controversial. There has to be something else at play here, and I think the way we need to look at it is to say, okay, he wrote this, but then he says, I advance it therefore as a suspicion only that the blacks, whether originally a distinct race or made so by time and circumstance, are not equal to the whites in the faculties of mind, etc., etc. But by saying that, just that one phrase, I advance it therefore as a suspicion only, that, to me at least, and if you think I'm being too generous, you're certainly free to comment. I mean, I'm happy to consider all perspectives here. But to me, when you say, I advance it therefore as a suspicion only, and knowing Jefferson's own Enlightenment tendencies, or his tendencies to draw upon the ideas and the lessons of the Enlightenment, here was Jefferson subjecting what was a popular prejudice, something that was conventional wisdom, right? I mean, this is just something you accept as a matter of course. Blacks are inferior. Jefferson says, well, this is what you're saying, that they are, and I've thought about this, and I've observed, and they possibly are. However, I advance it as a suspicion only that they are inferior. What we need are more observations. What we need is scientific inquiry on the question of race. So what Jefferson actually did, okay, and I think in his mind at least, this is what he actually did. It wasn't that he wrote down what everyone was thinking, and nowadays we get worked up about it because, well, he didn't think or behave the way we do. What Jefferson actually did was call into question the doctrine of racial superiority, was subject it to scientific inquiry. Okay? And that's a very different thing. I mean, nowadays, if we were to say, well, is one race superior to another? Well, I don't know. Let's subject it to a scientific test. Okay, that alone would be regarded as racist. I mean, in part because we already have the biological answer, but also because we don't want to go down that road. We've seen historically what happens when scientific racism becomes national policy, and we just don't want any part of that. But Jefferson in his day was actually using scientific inquiry to call into question a popular prejudice that he knew had no scientific backing. Okay? And when you consider that in light of what he was asking the Virginia legislature to do in the 1780s, which was to adopt a plan of gradual emancipation, and then with massive public investment, right, to eventually colonize those freed slaves, send them to Africa. You can't say back to Africa because most of them weren't born in Africa. They were Americans just like he was. But Jefferson wrote in Notes on Virginia that the principal obstacle to emancipation was what he called, quote, deep-rooted prejudices on the part of the whites and 10,000 recollections among the blacks of injuries sustained. Okay? And he went beyond that as well, but that's the passage wherein he lays out the primary obstacle to emancipation. He says, look, it's going to be very difficult to free the slaves and then incorporate them into the body politic for those reasons which he couldn't control and reasons which legislation itself could not eradicate, right? The prejudices and the resentment, prejudices on one side and deep and justifiable resentments on the other side. So to Jefferson, a well-meant colonization plan had to be part of any broader plan of emancipation. Now, in hindsight, lots of people have been critical of the American, what eventually became the American Colonization Society, and the efforts of people like Jefferson and Madison and Henry Clay, and even in the midst of the Civil War, Abraham Lincoln raised the possibility of emancipation, followed by colonization, followed by a mass exodus of former slaves from North America to Africa. But at the time, Jefferson most likely believed that was as far as philanthropy could go in Revolutionary era Virginia. Okay? So he tied emancipation to the prospect of colonization, and when you consider it in that way, then his argument that, well, the blacks and whites actually are different races, and that because of those racial differences, in addition to the prejudices and the resentments, it'll be difficult for whites and blacks to live together. Okay, and so that if you understand that he's arguing for gradual emancipation plus colonization, then the racial comments make a bit more sense. Okay? To us, they're abhorrent. To him, they're part of a broader plan to rid Virginia of slavery, and also, by the way, to rid Virginia of former slaves. Okay? So that's kind of a complicated brew, but I think it puts Jefferson's racial attitudes into the appropriate context. Okay? I do believe that in writing, I advance it as a suspicion only. Jefferson meant to subject Americans or human beings of different skin colors to scientific inquiry. Let's use science to figure out this problem of race and not simply allow popular prejudice to drive our laws and our behavior. So that's race. Now, on slavery, this is a much more, I think, complicated issue. The primary criticism leveled against Jefferson on slavery is that he spoke out against the institution, he wrote about it, but he never actually freed his own slaves, never freed more than a handful of them. And that's true. Okay? So On that front, he comes in for charges of hypocrisy. Some have thought him a bold-faced liar, right, because of the fact that he's arguing for emancipation over time or elsewhere, or he's arguing for the natural rights of all human beings, but then denying those natural rights to the people on his own farm or on his own plantation. And that strikes the modern ear as hypocritical. Now, I mean, before I get into that particular question, let me paint kind of a broader picture of Jefferson on slavery. Really one of the reasons I wanted to do this video, I've heard in recent days so many assertions made by different people and people on people with very different viewpoints on television or on the internet, assertions that have been so patently false that I can't believe that these people grew up in the same country that I did. I can't believe they ever read anything that even constitutes a passing reference to early American history. And I was particularly appalled when I observed a video earlier today, actually, a video of someone who I think is a descendant of Jefferson and Sally Hemings, his 3/4 English and 1/4 African descended supposed mistress, with whom he had a sexual relationship, the nature of which is still obscure and likely will always be obscure, supposedly starting after the death of Jefferson's wife in 1782. And Sally Hemings, Jefferson's slave and purported mistress, and I say purported, there has been DNA evidence, everyone in the historical circles knows about this, but DNA evidence dating back to 1998 that proves there is a familial connection between the Jeffersons and the Hemingses. The nature of that relationship is something that is probably going to be lost to history. But suffice it to say that there probably was a relationship, and this individual is said to be a descendant of Jefferson and Sally Hemings. And I forget the gentleman's name, and I apologize for that. I hate to cite nameless people, but I think his first name is Shannon, actually. And he said, the question had to do with whether or not the Jefferson Memorial should be taken down, and he said, I think we need to. And we need to rethink a lot of these monuments to my famous ancestor, in part because he said a lot of things about equality and liberty, but he never actually did anything to bring about equality and liberty. And when I heard that, I practically fell out of my chair, because it's such a grotesque falsehood that I couldn't believe what I was hearing from someone who supposedly has familial and ancestral connections to Jefferson. To say that he never did anything on equality and liberty is so absurd that it doesn't even bear another mention. If you look at it in a bigger picture, not simply on slavery, but even on slavery, even on that issue, where Jefferson never personally freed his slaves, and I'll come back to that. What did Jefferson actually do? I mean, the resume on that front is extensive and impressive, and I would venture to say, and I will challenge anyone to refute this, more human beings in the United States owed their freedom to Jefferson than to any other single individual up until Abraham Lincoln. No other American was responsible for a greater amount of freedom, primarily through the restriction of slavery, laws having to do with slavery, than was Jefferson. And I'll just go through some of these briefly because I know this is already getting on to be a longish video. I'll just go through some of the things that Jefferson did in his public life vis-a-vis slavery. Okay, we all know that he wrote the Declaration of Independence. Okay, all men are created equal, and that today many people, certainly the woke types will have nothing to do with that. But even people who have an open mind are sort of ask themselves, okay, well, what was he really doing there? What did he mean by that? Well, in the draft of the Declaration of Independence, some of you might know, Jefferson tried to insert a phrase, a clause that would have blamed the English king for imposing both slavery and the slave trade on the colonies. And, some people nowadays look back and say, oh, well, that's, just trying to pass the buck. Well, no, I mean, that's the reality of it. If you go back 100 years before the Revolution, and there was something called the Royal African Company that actually had a monopoly over the slave trade with English North American colonies. Eventually, that monopoly was done away with. Parliament did away with that in 1698. But in the 18th century, Great Britain became the largest single slave trading nation in the Atlantic world, and by extension in the world itself. Now, not all of those slaves went to British North America, the American colonies, future United States, but most of them did. Okay? Many of them did. Okay? And so Jefferson was right about that. So you have to begin by understanding that before 1776, if you were an American and you wanted to do something about slavery, you wanted to get rid of it, you couldn't. Okay? You were prohibited. Okay? Royal governors would have not only vetoed, I mean, they would have dissolved the assembly if they had to prevent that from happening. Okay? So our discussion really has to begin with 1776 because that's the moment of independence, both at the national and state levels. So we know Jefferson tried to blame the English king for the slave trade. Okay? In 1778, Jefferson authored. I don't think we actually have the physical documentation on this, but the authorship has been attributed to him, and he has claimed authorship of Virginia's statute banning the transatlantic slave trade. So that's 1778. The next year, 1779, Jefferson drafted what he called a bill concerning slaves. And this one actually kind of blows my mind, and I'm still trying to wrap my mind around it. It didn't become law until 1785, and when it did, a major section of Jefferson's draft of this bill concerning slaves from 1779, 6 years earlier, had been omitted. Now, I've only seen a handful of speculations as to why this particular portion of the bill was omitted, but none of those speculations have focused in on the part of that bill that I think is so astonishing. In that 1779 draft bill that became law in 1785, Jefferson wrote, and later legislatures excised this passage, Jefferson wrote that individual slaveholders may emancipate their slaves under the following conditions, and of course these were all legal conditions, right, having to do with the state of finances, the condition of the estate, the amount of debt, and he added on to the end, and with the free consent of the slave. And I remember, I think the first time I read that, it probably just went over my head, but maybe the third or fourth or fifth time I read it, I thought, wait a minute, the consent of the slave. I've looked at other statutes of both Virginia and elsewhere vis-a-vis emancipation. I've never yet seen the word consent attached to the condition of slavery. I mean, that's if that's what I think it is, then to me that explains why the Virginia legislature got rid of it. You don't want to attach the word consent, which is, I mean, that's enshrined in the Declaration of Independence. You don't want to attach that to the condition of a slave and assume that a slave can consent to anything. That's an extraordinarily revolutionary assertion that Jefferson wanted to include in this bill that ultimately was revised. Now, the nature of this subject, this general subject that we're on, is such that many of these conversations took place in private. So we'll never really know what someone believed or what someone's motives were. But that's not our concern. Okay, the absence of evidence is not proof of anything. I can only work with what I have, and what he did with that, in attaching consent, in requiring the free consent of the slave to his or her own manumission, emancipation. That's remarkable. And I went through and I looked at all the major biographers. I've yet to see any of the major Jefferson biographers who commented on that. So I'm very curious about where that might go as I look through that a little bit more. But in any case, that's in the Virginia legislature. In 1784, Jefferson was in Congress, the Confederation Congress, and he drafted an equally, I think, fascinating document called the Report on Western Government. And in that document, he was, outlining some possible ways of providing territorial government for what was at that time was called the Northwest Territory, but today it's the states of Indiana, Ohio, Illinois, Michigan, and Wisconsin. Okay, so Congress had acquired jurisdiction over that territory by the treaty that ended the American Revolution. Britain ceded that territory to the U.S., and so Congress had to provide for territorial government. And Jefferson, in that report, included an article that banned, or that would have banned slavery or involuntary servitude in that area, in that region after the year 1800. Would have banned it altogether. Well, that proposal in 1784, that report, when it came before the full Congress, lost by a single vote. And Jefferson was the only Southern member of Congress to vote in favor of that bill and its abolition of slavery after 1800. Well, 3 years later, Jefferson, of course, had moved on to France and was now serving as U.S. Minister to France. The Congress once again took up the question of territorial government for Ohio, Indiana, etc. And this of course is the debate that became, or that produced, the famous Northwest Ordinance. The Northwest Ordinance of 1787, even many modern students know, I shouldn't say many, some modern students know, that this was the bill that banned slavery in the old Northwest Territory, north and west of the Ohio River. Okay? So it took up Jefferson's old anti-slavery language from 1784 and put it into the actual Northwest Ordinance. But there was a catch this time. In 1787, in the actual Northwest Ordinance, the Congress included a corresponding provision that required the return of fugitive slaves, right? So any slave who escaped from, say, the Kentucky territory. I mean, Kentucky at that time was the westernmost county of Virginia, but anyone who escapes from Kentucky into Ohio, for instance, what would become the state of Ohio, would have to be returned. And so the condition that was attached by Southern members to ban slavery in that territory was the return of fugitive slaves. And now, of course, Jefferson in 1787 was out of the country, so he had nothing to do with those debates. It was only his anti-slavery language that was included in the Northwest Ordinance. But if you think about it, that because 1787 was a big year. Okay? Lots of people know this. That was also the year that the U.S. Constitution was adopted. Okay? So the delegates to the Philadelphia Constitutional Convention in the summer of 1787, when they found out about the Northwest Ordinance, they included that language, okay, that anti-slavery, or not the anti-slavery language, but the provision having to do with fugitives in the territories. Okay, they included that in Article 4, Section 2, right? Those who are bound to labor or service, et cetera, et cetera. Constitution never actually uses the word slavery, and that's by design, because people like James Madison didn't want to nationalize that institution. They didn't want it to become universal. They hoped that the states would get rid of it, as they were in the process of doing in the 1780s. So, but if you think about it, had Jefferson's anti-slavery clause been adopted, then there never would have been a need for a Northwest Ordinance, and therefore there wouldn't have been a fugitive slave clause. Therefore, there never would have been a fugitive slave provision in the U.S. Constitution. So, had the Congress accepted Jefferson's original version without the fugitive slave provision, we never would have had even a reference to fugitives in the U.S. Constitution. And we think about how that issue unfolded all the way down to the Civil War. I mean, South Carolina used the fugitive slave issue as justification for secession in 1860. So that's an area where Jefferson didn't quite get what he wanted, but got his anti-slavery, at least got that language into the ultimate document. As president in 1803, Jefferson personally drafted and then saw to it that Congress adopted the bill for the organization of what was then called Orleans Territory. Okay, that was the future state of Louisiana. This is in the aftermath of the Louisiana Purchase, and that the people who actually lived in New Orleans were a mixture of French and Spanish, Creoles, the free and enslaved people of African descent. There were Indians. There were all sorts of folks. And the slave trade had been legal under both Spanish and French law. And so Jefferson said, we're gonna ban the slave trade in Orleans Territory. He wrote that into the bill, and his allies in Congress got it through. And so Jefferson did, in fact, in one of the actually it was probably only the second, maybe the first or second instance of territorial organization, a bill for territorial organization coming before the United States government since the Northwest Ordinance. Jefferson personally saw to it that the slave trade was banned, very much against, from what we know, very much against the wishes of some of the most prominent, powerful citizens in New Orleans. And finally, as president, of course, Jefferson signed in 1807 the bill banning the slave trade from the United States altogether. So, these are this is a very extensive record of opposition to slavery and the slave trade. It's a mixed record of success, great deal of success on the slave trade, okay, which was the abominable nature of that practice. I think was more widely accepted. So it was easier for Jefferson to tackle the slave trade issue. Slavery itself, there were many Americans who liked liberty for themselves, but not so much for other people. They just didn't see the contradictions, and Jefferson had less success in persuading, in fact, he had no success in persuading his home state of Virginia to adopt a plan of emancipation similar to what he had observed, for instance, the state of Pennsylvania adopted in 1780, and that New England states were beginning to adopt in the mid 1780s. But be that as it may, there is absolutely no question that Jefferson did a good deal of labor on the problem of slavery and getting rid of slavery, and making sure that Americans understood that their natural rights were the gift of God and that they belonged to everyone. And this is one of those things I don't see how anyone can come up with an alternative argument. You can argue that Jefferson was a racist because by the strict definition of the word, he was. But even in saying that, well, maybe blacks are inferior to whites, and maybe they're not, but we need science to tell us. Even in saying that, he says that has no meaning when it comes to their natural rights to liberty. It was something that they all had, they all enjoyed, and had been denied to them at birth by an institution for which they were not responsible. So, with all of that, let me close by commenting on Jefferson's failure to free his own slaves, because this is where I think the charges of hypocrisy come in. And I'm not going to say that freeing his slaves would have been impossible, because I don't think I'm qualified to say that it would have been impossible. I don't know if there was a way that he could have done it, if there was any particular moment at which freeing his own slaves would have been possible. But I do know that lots of folks today who question why Jefferson didn't free his slaves, they never pose what to me is the next logical question, which is, well, how would you have done that? If you were a slave owner in Virginia in the 18th century, how would you have gone about freeing your slaves? And the answer is, I mean, you really have to go back through the individual laws of Virginia from the 18th century. And if you do that, I mean, you're going to find that it was pretty difficult. For instance, I mean, there was a law that went back to 1723. It was updated in 1748. I mean, you can look this up. It's in William Waller Henning's Virginia Statutes at Large. These publications came out in the early 19th century. You can find them online today. It's a wonderful resource. But there's a law from the early and then later in the mid 18th century that forbade Virginians from freeing their slaves unless those slaves had performed some meritorious service, and only then when the royal governor and council had signed off on it. So you actually needed a license from the governor of the colony and his 12-man council in order to free one of your slaves, if you were so inclined. And I don't know how many would have been inclined to do that anyway, given the prejudices. But the laws on the books actually made it impossible in the colonial era to free one's slaves. Again, apart from some meritorious service. In 1779, as I indicated, Jefferson attempted to update those laws by tacking on the idea of consent. Here, you can free your slaves under these conditions, but also it requires the free consent of the slaves. And that, to me, I don't know how that hasn't been more widely known than it is. I've yet to see any reference to it, as I said, in some of the major publications. If there is one out there, I'd love to see it, because I did not begin pursuing this question until recently. So Jefferson tried to do that with the revisal of the laws in 1779. Well, that law, again, ultimately became, or that draft became law in 1785. But in the meantime, in 1782, the Virginia legislature authorized individual slave owners to manumit their slaves, but again, under certain legal and financial conditions. You couldn't simply free your slaves, for instance, if those slaves were either above the age of 45, which that's actually me, so that's kind of depressing. If they were above the age of 45, you couldn't free them without making absolute provisions for their subsequent welfare. Okay, so if they were younger than 45, okay, but also older than 18 for women and 21 for men, if they were between the ages of 18 or 21 and 45, you could free them, provided you were in a financial position to do so. Otherwise, you could not emancipate slaves who were above 45 or younger than 18. Well, think about life on a plantation for a lot of these slaves. I mean, are those lives? If you just imagine them, especially on the larger plantations, is it a life of solitude, or have you, within the constraints of this hideous institution, have you built a family, even if it's not recognized in law, a family that includes husband or wife, children, elders, okay, extended families, the communities and the slave plantations, how many of those folks, like, are you're going to say, well, okay, I'm going to emancipate this 30-year-old male slave and his 25-year-old wife, but not their parents and not their children. Okay, you can't do that. So that's, I mean, this is much more complicated than folks have been led to believe. There were emancipations. Thousands of slaves were manumitted. They were freed from slavery, particularly by some of the wealthier. But if you were in a position where you didn't have a whole lot of cash, your land values were declining, and all you really had was a big house and the land and the slaves. You were what we would call cash poor, and so there was this appearance of relative opulence among the slaveholding class, but in fact, they were tied to the land and to the home, and especially to the slaves. The slaves were, I mean, the way they imagined their own slaves, they imagined them as members of their families, and they were these benevolent patriarchs, and a few of them behaved that way. Many of them did not, as we know. But I don't think we should dismiss the familial aspect of it, because there was. It wasn't simply that holding slaves was a privilege. There was a belief that it was a responsibility. That when you inherited slaves, as Jefferson did, you were responsible for them. Okay, it was a matter of honor that you provide for these people who, legally and as far as public prejudice is concerned, naturally can't provide for themselves. Well, obviously the doctrines of the American Revolution, cut some very serious holes in those racial theories, and the idea that slavery was an obligation because they can't take care of themselves. You can't reconcile that with natural rights, and I don't know of anyone who really tried to do that, because it's impossible. It's intellectually dishonest. But there is still that ingrained sense of responsibility for actual human beings, and if you set them free without providing for them, because you're unwilling, or in most cases unable to provide for them, that wouldn't have been permissible. It was not permissible by law if you could not provide, at least for the ones in the age brackets I mentioned. Then there's the question of whether or not you personally and or your estate owe massive amounts of debts. And Jefferson was in debt to everyone under the sun. And he had debts tobacco merchants and brokerage houses in Glasgow and London. He had local debts. He had transatlantic debts. He had debts to people in different states. Many of these debts, by the way, he inherited from his father-in-law, who was probably not a very good guy. I know he was a slave trader. Jefferson actually inherited both the debts and the slaves from his father-in-law, also inherited slaves from his father. So before Jefferson really could even come to maturity and think about these questions of slavery and natural rights in a coherent way, he was already responsible for all of these human beings. So I don't know when we question why someone would say slavery is a terrible thing, and then doesn't actually free his slaves. I think it requires at least another question beyond that, maybe multiple questions beyond that, if you really want to understand why these things happened the way they did with these particular individuals. Now, not everyone was Jefferson, for good or ill. Okay, I don't want to suggest that Jefferson is representative of a particular class or a particular type of person. There are reasons why Jefferson has a monument in D.C. and why he's on the nickel and on currency, and why various schools and towns and counties and other things have been named after him in his honor, why he has been, up until the present day, so revered by so many people. I mean, Jefferson was really exceptional as a human being. And so I don't know that necessarily we can draw broader conclusions about what I'm saying, but with respect to Jefferson and the current climate of canceling everything and wokeness and just this almost pathologically condescending approach to the American past. With Jefferson, the statues, the monuments, they're there for a reason. Okay? They're there for reasons that the people who are trying to tear everything down might not understand. In fact, almost certainly do not understand. But that doesn't change the fact that they're real. Okay, they exist. It is in fact possible to understand Jefferson's views on race and slavery and his behavior with respect to those two things without either discarding or even diminishing the larger part of his legacy. I indicated a while ago that I think Jefferson was responsible for more human beings living in freedom as an individual, was more responsible for that than anyone until Abraham Lincoln. And I base that primarily on his authorship of the Declaration of Independence, which inspired countless manumissions. Okay, we know this. Okay, the tenor of the times, the spirit of the age, was an enlightened one, a liberal one, and Jefferson, I think, was the ultimate spokesperson for that. And on the report on Western government in 1784, banning slavery in the future states of Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, Michigan, and Wisconsin. Okay? Those territories that became states, they were free primarily because of Jefferson. Okay, so that's this is not something that one can just brush under the rug because, well, we don't know what to do with it, and we've already heard that he's a hypocrite, and we don't like some of the racist things, so we'll just forget about that. No, if you're going to evaluate someone's legacy, then something like the anti-slavery clause in the Northwest Ordinance can't be ignored. Okay, so as far as what Jefferson really believed about all this stuff, I do think, as I said a moment ago, a lot of these conversations were held in private because publicly it was actually dangerous to say that you wanted to get rid of slavery in places like Virginia. Elsewhere, not so much, of course. In Pennsylvania, you get rid of it with very little controversy. But in places where some folks were still pretty deeply invested in the institution, it could be dangerous. And Jefferson actually experienced that as a young legislator in the colonial era. But anyway, what he thought about it personally might be lost to history. But I don't think it's unreasonable to suggest that he and most of the great founding fathers, the ones whose names we know, were deeply opposed to slavery. We know that Alexander Hamilton wrote in a private letter that he thought that the blacks would make good soldiers because their faculties, he said, are probably as good as ours. So you can say that in a private letter. In a book, it might be a little bit more controversial in 1784. So maybe he didn't have the courage to say publicly what he ought to have said publicly. You probably could go that far. But I don't think you can accuse Jefferson of being a racist slaveholder who somehow was out of touch with the liberal currents of his day. When in fact, I think exactly the opposite is true. Jefferson was both the manifestation and the representation of those broader egalitarian and libertarian currents that drove the American Revolution and that made the future appear so promising to the people who lived through that era. We know that things did not turn out the way people like Jefferson believed and hoped that they would, certainly not in the 19th century. But I still believe, in light of where we are, that it's important to make sure as many people as possible know what's really happening in the United States today with the assault on our history, and B, why that history is both false and dangerous, or why that assault on the history is both false and dangerous. So this video, which by now is much, much longer than I expected it would be, is my particular contribution to this particular subject, which has been so much a topic of conversation among so many people, and unfortunately without, in my view, much in the way of productive resolution. So thank you all for listening, and I hope you all got at least something out of this that could justify your investment of time. And I wish you all the best. Thank you.